In 1810, a pound of sugar cost the average English worker a full day of wages. By 1900, factory workers were stirring it into their tea 3 times a day. That shift from luxury to staple changed the world more than almost any other commodity in history. But sugar's story does not start in England or on a plantation. It starts in a jungle about 10,000 years ago. New Guinea islanders were the first to notice something remarkable. A wild grass, when chewed, released a sweetness unlike anything around them. They began replanting the sturdiest stalks. Without knowing it, they started the process that would turn a jungle weed into the most fought-over crop in human history. By around 1000 BC, sugarcane had traveled from New Guinea through Southeast Asia and into India. Traders carried it island to island, prizing it purely as a stick to chew. That journey covered nearly 4,000 miles of ocean and jungle. That is roughly the distance from New York to London. In 325 BC, one of Alexander the Great's admirals marched through India. His name was Nearchus, and he wrote home, describing a reed that produced honey without bees. The Greeks were stunned. For centuries afterward, sugar stayed exactly what it sounded like to them, a rumor from the edge of the known world. Then, sometime around 350 AD, Indian farmers solved the problem that had kept sugar a local secret. They worked out how to boil cane juice down and let it crystallize into hard, storable grains. No one had managed that before, not once. Raw cane juice rotted within a day. The crystals could sit in a jar for years. The Sanskrit word for these grains was sharkara. It eventually gave English the words sugar and candy besides. A jungle snack had just become a tradable good. It was about to leave India for good. So Arab armies swept out of Arabia in the 7th century. They carried sugarcane cuttings along with new irrigation techniques, planting fields wherever the climate allowed, from Persia to Egypt to Sicily and southern Spain. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land in the 12th century tasted it for the first time. They were astonished by it. Within a generation, sugar in Europe was being treated the way we treat gold today. Kings displayed sugar sculptures shaped like castles and swans at royal banquets. They were built purely to be admired, then broken apart. English monarchs kept detailed sugar inventories. They tracked every pound the way modern governments track gold reserves. A single feast could burn through roughly 300 pounds of sugar. That was a sum worth more than a knight's annual income. Apothecaries locked it behind their counters alongside opium because sugar was classified as medicine, not food. Physicians prescribed it for everything from coughs to melancholy. They were certain that sweetness itself carried healing power. If you could afford sugar, you were somebody. If you could not afford it, you probably never tasted it in your life. That kind of scarcity could not last forever. But there was a problem. Sugarcane needs tropical or subtropical climates to grow. You cannot grow it in England. You cannot grow it in France. And you definitely cannot grow it in Scandinavia. For centuries, that single fact capped how much sugar the world could ever have, no matter how many kings wanted it. This is the part of sugar's history that most people never learn about, and it is the part that shaped the modern world more than almost anything else. The demand was already there. The supply was not. So European powers stopped trying to grow sugar at home. Instead, they moved the plant. In the 1420s, Portuguese sailors planted sugarcane on the Atlantic island of Madeira. They picked a patch of ocean warm enough to fool the crop. It worked. In 1493, Christopher Columbus carried sugarcane cuttings across the Atlantic on his second voyage. He planted them on the island of Hispaniola. Within decades, Portuguese planters had built an entire sugar economy in Brazil. Rival colonial powers watched their profits and grew envious. By the 1600s, Dutch, English, and French colonists were fighting outright wars over small Caribbean islands, purely for their sugar potential. Barbados, an island only about 2.5 times the size of Washington, D.C., became so valuable that England later traded away control of what is now Suriname just to hold on to Barbados. Suriname, apparently, was worth less than sugar. Sugar was no longer a luxury a king displayed once a year. It was becoming an industry, and an industry needs workers, land, and mills running around the clock. English planters on Barbados figured out how to run all three at a scale nobody in Europe had attempted. What they had not figured out yet was who would actually do the work. So at first, planters relied on indentured European servants and enslaved Native Americans. That did not last. European servants died from tropical disease almost as fast as they arrived. Native populations across the Caribbean had already been devastated by disease and violence. Too few people were left to enslave at the scale plantations needed. A Barbadian planter named James Drax is credited with assembling the system that solved this problem for plantation owners. He combined African enslavement with the boiling and crushing process Brazilian planters had already perfected. By 1661, Barbados had passed a formal slave code. It was a set of laws stripping enslaved Africans of any legal status as people and making their bondage hereditary. Sugar did not just benefit from slavery anymore. Sugar now depended on it entirely, engineered so that every stage, from planting to boiling, assumed a captive workforce that could never leave, never be paid, and never stop. The Caribbean climate was perfect, the soil was perfect, and the demand back in Europe was insatiable. So getting sugar out of a cut cane stalk required speed as much as strength. Once cut, the stalks had to be crushed within hours before the juice inside began to ferment and spoil. So the harvest ran non-stop, day and night, for months at a time. Enslaved workers fed the cane by hand into rolling mills powered by wind, water, or oxen. Their fingers worked inches from the crushing rollers. Plantation owners kept hatchets close by the machinery so that a trapped limb could be severed quickly before the roller pulled a person's entire body through. Inside the boiling house nearby, temperatures regularly passed 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Burns from the open kettles were treated as routine, an accepted cost of doing business. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forced across the Atlantic Ocean, more than twice the population of Ireland today. The majority of them were sent to work sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil. On those plantations, the average enslaved person survived only about 7 years after arrival. 7 years. Think about that. Plantation owners calculated that it was cheaper to work people to death and buy replacements than to provide humane living conditions. The account books from the period record exactly that math, in their own handwriting. If this story is landing hard, hit subscribe. We cover histories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. This is the mechanism that let a pound of sugar drop from a full day's wages in 1810 to something a factory worker could stir into tea 3 times a day by 1900. The cost was never paid in coin. It was paid in lives, over and over. On islands most of those workers would never leave alive. Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, and a dozen islands after them. The names changed, but the machine underneath them did not. And still, the system did not run itself quietly forever. By the 1780s, the French colony of Saint-Domingue had become the richest colony on Earth. It was producing roughly 40% of the sugar and 60% of the coffee consumed in Europe. All of it was grown by an enslaved population that outnumbered free colonists roughly 10 to 1, a steeper ratio than almost anywhere else. In 1791, enslaved workers turned the same machetes they used to cut cane into weapons. They rose up in a coordinated revolt that white planters had insisted, for over a century, could never happen. Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved man, emerged as the revolution's most capable general. He defeated French, Spanish, and British forces. By 1804, the colony had become Haiti, the first nation in the Americas founded by a successful slave revolt, and the only one in history. Sugar production on Haiti collapsed, almost overnight. The shockwaves reached every plantation economy in the hemisphere. Slaveholders elsewhere panicked. They tightened laws across their own plantations. Abolitionists in Britain had spent decades documenting conditions like these. They finally had a demonstration the public could not ignore. Britain outlawed its slave trade in 1807 and abolished slavery across its empire in 1833. The system built on sugar was coming apart at the seams it had never bothered to hide. Between 1806 and 1814, Napoleon's naval blockade cut off Caribbean sugar imports to Europe almost entirely. The continent learned that its sugar supply could vanish overnight. German and French chemists had spent years testing whether ordinary beets, a vegetable that grew perfectly well in cold European soil, could yield the same sweet crystals as tropical cane. Napoleon, desperate for a domestic source, ordered tens of thousands of acres planted with sugar beets, an area several times the size of Paris. Within a few years, French engineers had built the first industrial beet sugar factories. By the 1880s, European beet sugar had overtaken cane sugar entirely. The wall that had stood for 10,000 years, the simple fact that sugar needed a tropical climate, was finally broken. Not by force, by a root vegetable in a French field. Sugar prices collapsed. Across Europe, almost overnight, what had once cost a day's wages was becoming something nearly anyone could afford. The plantations that grew it still needed hands to work them. But cheaper sugar did not mean the labor problem was solved. It just moved to a different continent. When Britain abolished slavery across its empire in 1833, sugar planters in the Caribbean suddenly faced a workforce that was, for the first time, legally free to leave. A Scottish plantation owner named John Gladstone, who owned sugar estates in British Guiana, petitioned the British government for permission to import workers from India under fixed labor contracts instead. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. In January of 1838, two ships, the Whitby and the Hesperus, carried the first several hundred Indian laborers across the ocean to Gladstone's plantations. Conditions on board were brutal. More than a dozen people died during the crossing on the Hesperus alone, before the workers had done a single day of labor. The contracts promised a fixed wage. They promised a return passage after 5 years. In practice, indentured workers were housed in the same barracks formerly used for enslaved people, and punished the same way for missing quotas. Word of the abuses reached London. Quickly, Parliament was alarmed enough to suspend the entire program within a few years. That suspension did not last. Demand for cheap plantation labor was too strong, and the system resumed and expanded. Over the following decades, an estimated 1.6 million Indian workers were transported under indenture contracts to sugar colonies across the British Empire, roughly the population of a large modern city, scattered from Mauritius to Trinidad to Fiji. Slavery had a legal end date. The demand for captive, controllable labor on sugar plantations did not. This is the part that should make you angry. That demand was about to find a new target. That demand for cheap sweetness never really left. It just changed shape. In 1965, the Sugar Research Foundation quietly paid Harvard researcher Mark Hegsted the equivalent of about $48,000 today. The payment was to write a scientific review blaming heart disease on fat instead of sugar, without disclosing who had funded it. Researchers who later exposed the funding were furious. Today, the average American consumes roughly 17 teaspoons of added sugar every single day, about the weight of a chocolate bar. It is hidden in food that does not taste sweet at all. That is almost 3 times what health authorities recommend. A crop that once required a tropical climate and millions of enslaved and indentured people to produce now arrives before breakfast, unquestioned. Over 10,000 years, sugar traveled from a wild grass chewed by island foragers to the single most consequential commodity in the history of the Atlantic world. Sugar was never just a sweetener. It built fortunes. It fueled empires. It required the forced labor of millions of human beings who never chose to be part of its story. A 10,000-year-old grass from a jungle in New Guinea became the mechanism behind one of the largest forced migrations in human history. It was there when kings displayed it as treasure. It was there when 12.5 million people were stolen from their homes. It was there when a revolution in Haiti proved an empire could be beaten. Sugar did not stop being powerful once slavery ended. It simply learned to hide. And it is sitting in your kitchen right now, in your cereal, your coffee, your bread, waiting to be noticed. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind the food on the table. We have got a lot more coming.